Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Tamarack Institute webinar titled Impact Networks, Building Relationships Across Boundaries to Catalyze Systems Change. My name is Jaime Stief, and I am a community animator with the Tamarack Institute, and I'm joined by my colleague Jean-Marie Chapeau and David Ehrlichman, who is the author of the book we'll be discussing today. Before we get started, we just want to start with a land acknowledgement, just acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And as we do the work to realize the calls to action for truth and reconciliation, it's important for us to, as an act of truth, acknowledge the Indigenous territories that we occupy. I'm joining from the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, colonially known as Waterloo, Ontario. And we encourage you all to share the territories that you are joining us from in the chat box today. And with that, I am going to introduce Jean-Marie.
Hey, thanks, Jamie, and hello, everybody. I'm Jean-Marie Chapeau. I'm the Consulting Director Evaluating Impact at Tamarack Institute, and I'm calling from the traditional territory of the Ghanaian-Gihaga Nation. Diodiaki is colonially known as Montreal in Quebec. As Jamie mentioned, our webinar is Impact Networks, Building Relationships Across Boundaries to Catalyze System Change. And I am really excited to be joined today by David Ehrlichman, who is the author of a great book called Impact Networks. And that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. David is a co-founder and coordinator of Converge. Converge is a network of systems strategists, designers, facilitators, evaluators, educators who partner with people and organizations on networks to navigate complexity and co-create meaningful change. With his colleagues, he has supported the development of dozens of impact networks, taking action on issues as diverse as economic mobility, environmental stewardship, human rights, and healthcare reform. And before working for Converge, David was a consultant with Monitor Institute, and this is where he was first introduced to the power of networks. So David, you are calling from the beautiful city of Seattle and the ancestral territory of the Coast Salish peoples. I wanted to spend a bit of time before we got into the content to know you better. So I shared your bio, but what would you like the first one on the call today to know about you, something unique about yourself?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the intro. It's wonderful to be here with you all. Well, I have two little dogs that are sleeping next to me, and hopefully they stay sleeping. But even more importantly, I have a 15-month-old daughter. Her name is Elena, and she has just become my greatest teacher right now in being present, because she's always very, very present in the moment. Whatever she's feeling, what she's wanting, what she's thinking about, it's very expressed on her face and in her early words. And it's making me notice the sort of times that I reach for my phone and I have that instinct, but then I think about what she's noticing and how much she's watching me. So that's been the biggest change in my life recently.
Wow, that's really nice, David. So let's dive in your book. You invite us to dive into the notion of impact networks. You encourage us to navigate the systems we are involved in using a different approach by changing our mindset and by analyzing and representing these systems as impact networks. where I would say the understanding of the connections between actors is key. So I have to say that your work provides a very, very accessible entry point to some of the basic principles of social network analysis or social network mapping, social network science. And yeah, I have to say that after reading your book, it's exciting to see all the potential application of impact networks on our own works to change the systems. So first question, what is your own experience with the strategic use and the representation of networks? What motivated you to develop and clarify the notion of impact networks?
My journey into this work started about 15 years ago or so. I was working at a nonprofit organization here in the greater Seattle region. This organization is still around today. They do amazing work. They support people without shelter to get trained in and find jobs in the culinary industry. And but when I was there, I was started to notice how it felt like they were changing people's lives, but working in this massive broken system that just creates a chronic lack of affordable housing 15 years ago, still maybe even worse today. And in some ways, addressing the symptoms of this massive broken system. And I also noticed how the organization was rightfully so very focused on their own work and showing their donors that their work was having a direct impact, but at the same time really primarily focused on their own organization and their own work, not really interacting with other organizations and other sectors or other actors across the system who are also touching this big complex issue in lots of different ways. And so I started to get really curious about how we could work not just within individual organizations, but really across organizations and even across sectors to address these big systemic issues that we have. And so that was really the guiding question that stuck with me. How can we work not just within organizations or silos, but really across systems? And eventually that led me to Monitor Institute. And when I was there at the time, Monitor was doing a lot of work in multi-stakeholder collaborations. They were doing a lot of research and writing. And that was one of the light bulb moments for me, that it was actually possible that there was a deliberate approach we could take to strengthen connections across systems, to strengthen the flows of information and resources between organizations, and to do things together that we couldn't do alone, and building on lessons from social movements and community organizing and community building, and then also bringing in new lessons from network science and integrating systems thinking. And that eventually led me, I left Monitor and ended up spending about 3 years in Fresno, California, helping to cultivate a network of 48 different organizational leaders from across all sectors to revitalize their city. And that was really where I first saw intimately the power of relationships in this work and the power of trust in this work. We brought people together who had very different points of view about the right ways to move forward, and people who were even on opposite sides of issues, public school advocate and the charter school advocate, the environmental activist and the enlightened developers. But we dug deep enough and people really shared their stories and their deep, intimate connections with that place, started to see that there was actually a lot of common ground.
Yeah, and that's a segue to my second question, actually. Today on the call, we have a lot of practitioners involved in poverty reduction strategies, on climate transition strategies. What does the network science bring to actors who collaborate for system change?
Well, networks are all around us, right? Whether we're aware of them or not. They influence who we're connected to, where we get our information, how work gets done. Most people are aware of social networks, but what many people don't realize is that networks can be deliberately organized to do so much more than just create connection. They can also be organized to spark learning and to distribute resources to where they're needed most, and to catalyze new action and even cohere social movements together. They can span the typical boundaries that we often create for ourselves, and whether it's the boundaries of a particular organization or a sector or the people we typically interact with. And because they're tied together through relationships and shared intentions, not through legal agreements. And so networks can take us places that many other structures can't. But because hierarchies and networks are so different, working with networks calls for different forms of leadership and different forms of participation and really different mindset. That network mindset shift can take some getting used to, particularly for those of us who have been socialized and spent the majority of our lives and careers being trained in hierarchical environments like schools and many offices.
Yeah, you have prepared well, you have prepared a few slides about this point. Do you want us to share them?
Sure, we can go to the next slide. That when we embrace the network mindset, it's about we stop working in isolation. Right? We turn our focus towards cultivating connections and starting to notice more intently how our efforts are related to others. So rather than trying to scale up a bigger and bigger organization, we can seek to scale out, increase our impact through collaboration. And this slide, you can think of it this way. Many organizations tend to see themselves at the center of the universe, or at least focus their attention that way for many justifiable reasons. And there are many other potential stakeholders situated around them that they could collaborate with to further their own mission. On the next slide, we can see the essential shift is to see ourselves and our organizations as part of this larger interconnected system of different actors and organizations, right? We're not the sun at the center of a solar system, even though we're usually the heroes of our own stories. Instead, we're one star in this huge and diverse constellation. And so rather than putting ourselves or organizations at the center of our focus all the time, what would happen if we put shared purpose at the center? What's a core issue that you care about that many other groups also care about? And then on the next slide, when we find that purpose or purposes that connect different groups together, we can work to strengthen the connections and flows of information between them. And that's really what it means to build a network. So network science specifically is about understanding the webs of connections that tie us together and also what's flowing through those connections. I love this Fritjof Capra quote. He says, at all levels of life, from the metabolic networks inside cells to the food webs of ecosystems and the networks of communications in human societies, the components of living systems are interlinked in network fashion. So by understanding how these systems are connected, we can identify places where the system is fragile, and as in where different parts of the system are connected only by a single person or a single organization or narrow bridge. We can start to understand what clusters exist, where people are much more connected with each other than they are with other parts of the system, and where echo chambers exist, who might be in positions of influence, who's kind of on the outside, and how we can deliberately weave connections together across the system to make it more resilient and to help spark the flow of information and resources across it. So the network.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Just gonna wrap that up as saying the networks that underlie our organizational and social and planetary systems have a huge influence on how healthy and effective those systems ultimately are.
So we understand that the analysis of the relationships between actors is as important as the analysis of the actors themselves. And could you give us some examples of context where the understanding of the links between actors is crucial to understand the functions of a system? And I know that you have prepared a few slides too.
Yeah, we can go to the first slide here because it's really helpful to see the visuals when describing this. And this actually is from my work in Fresno. And what these maps show is how the different actors in this network were connected together at different points, and also then what that told us as coordinators and facilitators and also the participants of how this network is evolving and what they could do to strengthen it and to strengthen the system as a whole. So this first map here, the circles are individual actors. A connecting line is a relationship, frequent communication between those two actors. This is based on self-reported survey data. And the colors here represent their sector, their primary sector of focus. So this particular map was done before the first cohort of 12 had ever convened together as part of this network. So we can see there were already some connections, some relationships that existed, right? But But by and large, most people only had, one or two maybe connections with other folks. And so then 3 months later, go to the next slide, we updated the survey and we can see, okay, this group of 12 really tightly connected. This is kind of more what we're looking for. So the work we did in those initial months had an effect on this initial cohort. But then on the next slide, we added in the second cohort of 12 folks. And this was the map that was done right when we added in that second group of 12. And it looks from this view like, okay, the network's really healthy, it's really well connected. But actually, on the next slide, we can see if we identify the different individuals, their nodes, by the cohort that they were in, where the blue folks were from the first cohort, and the red folks were from the second cohort, you can actually see that the network is kind of made up of two parts. And this really told us, and also told participants, that we need to be much more deliberate about actually weaving connections between the different cohorts together. Otherwise, we were just creating little cliques or clusters. And then on the next slide, we added in about 6 months later, a third cohort, which was in green. And you can see there, and by segmenting this by the color and the cohort, that those folks were kind of on the periphery, kind of on the outside, coming into this group that had already done a lot of work in building relationships with one another. And that told us again that we need to be really deliberate about weaving them in. Otherwise, they were going to feel like kind of outsiders coming into this thing that already existed. I think the most interesting slide, though, is the next one, where we took the same map and then identified people by their larger issue focus, where the pink nodes are folks who are focused in government or business sectors. The green nodes are folks who are focused on education and nonprofits, and then the blue, health and human rights. And why this was so fascinating is because we had been hearing all along, and participants have been talking to one another about how government and business folks were really tightly connected. They were making a lot of the decisions. A lot of other leaders in their organizations kind of felt like on the outside of these conversations. They were not invited to the table. And we showed this map to the participants in one of the convenings that we had. And if you had looked around the room, you would have seen the government and business folks sitting next to each other right then and there. And this was a little bit of a wake-up call. It was actually allowing them to see their system from a bird's eye view, maybe for the first time, to actually have this empirical evidence that these patterns of connection that you've been talking about and you've been saying you want to break, they're just being replicated here in this room. And so, how can we now, with this new awareness, change our behavior and change our intentions around really deliberately forming connections, not just with the people that we're already comfortable with or that we're already used to connecting with, but with having conversations with people we don't normally have them with, and building those different types of relationships so that we can work again across sectors and across the whole system. So this is an example of where this type of network analysis can really identify some interesting patterns that are going on, identifying some opportunities for intervention, and also shift people's awareness of what's happening across the system. I have one more example. If we go 2 more slides forward, or 3 more, I should say. Keep going. 1 more.
3 more slides.
The one previous. There we go. This is another example that I think is really telling. This is a map of a school district staff and their parent volunteers. So the larger square nodes here are staff members of a specific school district, which I mapped. And the smaller nodes, both the small gray and the small black nodes, are parent volunteers who are volunteering their time in some way, engaging with the school. What the school was interested in understanding was how they could better engage their parent volunteers. And the key finding here is that the small dark black nodes here, those represent a particular group of parents. They were Hmong parents. And you can see that this particular community of parents were primarily connected to the school just through 1 or 2 staff members, particularly the one that I've circled there. And what this said very clearly is that there's a very narrow bridge. This network is potentially fragile based on the connection with that one staff member. If the school district were to lose that staff member for some reason, they're unavailable for some reason, they're then losing their connections with this huge and really important community of parents. And so this told the school district that they either needed, one, not lose that staff member, but also create wider bridges, right? Diversify the connections between parents with different staff members so that it's not dependent on a single person. This is often what we can see in this type of mapping work as well, is where there's points of fragility in the system, and how we can work to strengthen those.
Yeah, that's really nice. We have a question on the chat, and I want to ask you this question right now because I had it also. When in the examples that you shared, can you give us examples of connections, actual connections that you represent? Is it people are talking one to each other? Is it formal partnership? Is it informal? Can you give us a few examples?
Yeah, so the connections can be defined however you want in this type of mapping work, based on the context. How I often define them is allowing people to rate from a scale of 0 to 3 the degree of their relationship, or 0 to 4, I should say. 0 is never met this person before, right? 1 is we have a connection, but we're not regularly communicating or engaging. 2 is we're communicating, we're regularly communicating, sharing information and data with one another. 3 is we're actually coordinating our efforts, but we're not really making shared decisions. We're not sharing resources, but we're coordinating, we're aware of each other's work, and we're actively working together in some ways. And then the next stage is collaborating, that we're actively working together, we're partnering together on some type of issue or initiative, we're making shared decisions and sharing resources. And so then you can see that in those types of maps, I don't have any here prepared, but you can see the evolution from we're connected to we're actively communicating to we're actually coordinating and collaborating with one another. We can see the patterns of collaboration that are happening across the system, which is really interesting. In these particular cases that I've shared here, we're just looking at the relationships with regular communication. So it's kind of that communication level.
That's fantastic, David. You shared with us how we represent and how we use the representation of impact networks. Now I have a question about how there is a whole chapter in your book about cultivating impact networks. So how do we cultivate impact networks?
Sure. If we go to the next slide, we can see kind of a common progression in the relational structure of these networks and how they often form. Usually systems start like something like this. Right? People work in scattered fragments. Some people in organizations know each other and work together, but overall the system is fairly fragmented without information flowing between these different clusters of activity. And then if we go to the next slide, we can see that very often the first step is for some group or some person to see the opportunity to connect these different parts of the system together in a more deliberate way. And these diagrams, by the way, are from June Hawley and Valdez Krebs, from some of their early works that was really influential in my thinking. But importantly, though, we don't want to stop here, because right here, the system, the network is dependent on that central node, that hub at the middle of it. And instead, we want to continue to strengthen and diversify the connections to go to the next stage, next slide, which is called a multi-hub network. Where
David, just if I can interrupt for a moment, we had a clarifying question in the chat,
sure,
which was asking about what the lines represent specifically. Is it something like a conversation with another node, or is it something deeper or more periodic? Just as you explain this.
Sure, these are general maps from June Hawley and Valdez Krebs. So this is really about the connectivity of the system. It might mean many different things, but this is we can just think of this as connectivity and kind of which would lead to communication and coordination and so forth. But right now we're kind of just looking at connectivity. These are not specific maps to any particular group. These are generic, kind of a model of how we see these networks often form. So in this stage, it's a multi-hub network. So people are connected, and then also information and resources are flowing across the network from person to person, organization to organization, without having to go through that centralized entity, right? That central hub. And then in the final stage, next slide, it grows into this, what's called a core periphery network, where there's a highly interconnected group of people in the network's core, and then also a large and diverse periphery that serves as a source of new ideas and new connections to other networks. And of course, this is a static image, but really these networks are very fluid. People are coming in and out. These connections are changing all the time. But this is just a model that, and Juno and Vasquez kind of identified almost 2 decades ago, and has been so consistent across the different mapping work that I've done with these networks. One interesting thing, though, if we go to the next slide, is that networks are not about having everybody be fully engaged all the time. We really see this common pattern where there's often about 20% of people who are in the core, really engaged, taking leadership roles, moving things forward. And there's about 40% of people who are partnering in it, who are showing up, not taking as much of a leadership role, but they're staying engaged, they're tracking, et cetera. And then there's another 40% of people who maybe are on the mailing list, but they're kind of MIA at any time. And that's okay. We want to allow people to be engaged at different levels at different times, and for people to come in and out from the network's core to its periphery based on their interests, their level of engagement, and so forth. So we're not trying to, in networks, we're not trying to get everybody to do one thing together. It's really about strengthening the system as a whole. How can we create more stronger, more resilient, healthier systems by increasing connectivity and communication and collaboration across the system as a whole? Kind of like a murmuration of starlings, if you can imagine that. Some birds cluster together, they're focused on something or moving something forward. Another cluster of birds is clustered together and doing something else, but then the whole thing kind of keeps evolving and stays in communication, stays in connection with each other, seeing and sensing what each bird is up to. I can continue to get a little bit deeper into the specific how of how these networks are cultivated. If we go to the next slide, there are really 5 core activities of impact networks that I've seen over and over again. They are clarify purpose and principles, convene the people, cultivate trust, coordinate actions, and then collaborate for systems change. And these 5 activities, they're not linear, they're dynamic and interdependent. They're also never fully complete. They loop back and forth on each other as the network evolves, and they're going to be revisited over and over again throughout a network's life cycle. But as we saw earlier, one of the first steps is to identify that shared purpose. If we go to the next slide, that shared purpose in the center. Right? The purpose is what inspires people to join and contribute their time and energy. Because impact networks, they can't be controlled, but they can be oriented around a shared purpose. And then as the network clarifies its purpose, it's also really helpful to articulate shared principles. And principles are fundamental beliefs about how network members intend to conduct themselves and work together in pursuit of that purpose. This is where many networks have embedded equity in their work, in their purpose. The REAMP's purpose, for example, is to equitably reduce carbon emissions across the Midwest of the United States, or in their principles. Taking action to advance racial equity is a key principle that drives the work of Sterling Network NYC, which is 50 organizations working to advance economic mobility in New York City. So you can think of it this way: principles surround the purpose and create guidelines for how the network will make collective decisions. And together, purpose and principles create this foundation for vibrant, but also coherent self-organization. And then the next slide, we want to create opportunities for people to become connected around that purpose, virtually, in person, sometimes individually, sometimes all at once, in convenings that bring the whole network together. And who to engage in an impact network really depends on its purpose and context and timing and scope. But when considering who to engage, to quote Adrienne May Brown, bring together those who, number 1, are directly impacted by the issue, 2, are doing compelling work on the issue, and 3, can move the work forward. And it's really important to make a priority to convene a diverse set of participants from the very beginning, not later after the effort's already been defined, because whatever patterns are established in the early stages of a network's formation, either consciously or subconsciously, they're likely to persist for a while. And also one more thing on this, convening people doesn't mean inviting them into your thing. It means inviting them into co-creating what's possible now that they're part of the group. And the next slide, as we bring people together, the next focus is then to cultivate relationships of trust, to take the time to understand what each other cares about and needs, to build deep human connection so that we can have the honest conversations that are necessary. We don't build trust so that we like each other. We actually don't need to like each other to work together. And we don't build trust certainly that we can agree with each other, rather so that we can disagree, so that we can hold the tension through the inevitable disagreements and conflicts we'll face and hang in there long enough until we can find a slice of common ground, or at least have greater shared understanding of each other's perspectives. And then the next 3 slides show another progression of a particular network. This one is Sterling Network NYC, again, working to advance economic mobility and racial justice across New York City. As we build trust, we coordinate actions by creating stronger flows of information and knowledge and resources across the network. Again, here, the circles are individual organizational leaders. The connecting lines, again, in this case, is regular communication between these 2 leaders. And this gives you an example, again, how those connections and flows can evolve as networks form. Before the network was formed, there wasn't much information flowing between these leaders and as a result between the organizations. And then over time, people are finding new and innovative ways to work together. And you can also see that the network started to identify some gaps in terms of who was involved. So it brought in members from a new sector, the purple circles, and then later in another sector, the yellow circles. And at this point here, you can see this network has that dense core periphery structure that we talked about, all in service of that shared purpose of advancing economic mobility and racial justice. But then finally, the next slide, in addition to coordinating the things we're already doing, and that coordination is really understanding what's already happening so that we can connect the dots, we can also then collaborate in new ways to create change at the systems level. And that requires making collective sense of what's happening in the system from many different perspectives, bringing our pieces of the puzzle together to see the big picture and to take action on key leverage points, places where Donald Mills has said, a focused effort on one thing can create big changes throughout the whole system. One example of collaborating for system change, the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network, where I worked for a few years to get started, still around today. It brings together 24 different organizations to steward 500,000 acres of land. So that includes government agencies and land trusts and academic institutions, tribal groups, and timber companies to collectively steward this large landscape. And they disagreed about a lot of different things, but they also recognized the ecological and cultural importance of the land, and they found opportunities, taking the systems view, to collaborate in ways that would support all their work, or at least a large subset of the group, things that where they overlapped and collectively cared about. So some specific examples, they partnered together to launch a massive region-wide vegetation mapping project, which was the first of its kind, and they're using that data to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. So that required them to pool their different data sets together for the first time. And then they also sparked a statewide initiative to reduce barriers to environmental restoration, which is called cutting green tape, which is removing counterproductive barriers to preserving and restoring natural resources across California. Because a group network members got together and they realized that the permitting processes for important environmental restoration work, like restoring a creek bed, was pretty much the same as building a new condo. Very costly, very time consuming. And so that cutting green tape initiative is about removing those counterproductive barriers. Those are really the 5 core activities: clarifying purpose and principles, convening people, building trust, coordinating things that we're already doing, and then seeing the whole system and finding places where we can collaborate to take action.
Mm-hmm. In fact, you already started to answer the next question, but you talked about leadership, engagement, trust, what is a network leader? What are the key qualities and skills that a field practitioner should master to be a network leader?
Yeah. Many people assume that networks like this just happen, that people will self-organize spontaneously. And while that can happen, it's actually extremely rare. And usually spontaneous self-organization only goes so far. The reality is that leadership always matters. It's just a different form of leadership than the one we see in hierarchical environments. It's more akin to facilitative leadership or servant leadership. Rather than defining rigid structures and rules, network leaders really nurture a culture of trust and reciprocity. Instead of command and control, they seek to connect and collaborate. They're not there to tell people what to do, but to foster opportunities for self-organization and to support people to discover what they can and want to do together. And network leaders are, I've seen over and over again, they're so often what make the difference, but because they're usually so humble and so quick to share the credit, we rarely ever know who they are. And I don't think we recognize or resource them in the way that we should. They are the people who seed a vision for change and inspire new networks to form. They help the network to clarify its purpose and principles and to cultivate those connections. They share power, they facilitate collective decision-making processes, and they create opportunities for other people to step into leadership in a variety of ways. And they also demonstrate an incredible amount of care for the network. They take responsibility to nurture its growth and consistently anticipate its needs and challenges, but they also are sharing that responsibility completely with others. A few kind of key roles that I see network leaders play, which may be a single individual, it may be many different individuals playing these different roles. Again, in networks, anyone can really be a leader. Leadership is required. Some key roles, one is catalyst, catalyzing the network, bringing the people together for the first time, but also catalyzing an important conversation, catalyzing a project, taking that initiative to spark something. And then weavers deliberately connect people together. They're weaving the threads that tie the network together. They're fostering introductions and making connections between people. And facilitators are holding space and helping all voices be heard and leading meetings and convenings that flow in a beautiful way. And then coordinators, people who are often doing the behind the scenes, back of the house work, but providing the enabling infrastructure for the network, the communication systems, the way we share data, tracking, evaluation, and so forth. So those are four leadership roles that we really often see: catalyzing, weaving, facilitating, and coordinating.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And in order to catalyze, to weave, to coordinate, and to facilitate, we need some tools. There are several mapping tools to help people and field practitioners. Personally, I used a lot Gephi. I use Kumu also with clients. What do you think of the current tools on the market? But I have another question also. Is it possible to represent our networks without these technological tools? We saw a very nice picture, probably taken from a drone of actual people in a space. So what is it possible? So what are the tools that you use, and what is it possible to represent a network without these tools?
Yeah, I started using Gephi over a decade ago, and that was my preferred tool for a while. It's really powerful and open source. But then I started to use Kumu a lot more because it's much easier to share with others and much more interactive. People can just access Kumu through a browser. They don't need to log in to anything. And so currently my preferred tools are Kumu, but paired with something called SumApp, just from Greater Than the Sum, which is a survey instrument that plugs in directly with Kumu and allows people to revisit their survey at any point in the future and update their responses, and it automatically gets shown on the map. And so it's been a really easy way to create asset maps and to create social network maps that then can evolve over time. A couple others, Some app also plugs in with Graph Commons, which is a really powerful tool. I know the partner mapping system, many people use that, and it's a very powerful tool. But it is possible to represent networks without these technological tools. We can just do it analog. We can get people together and have all the individuals in the network kind of maybe as represented as a pin around a big circle, and you can have people kind of draw the connections between them, who are the people that you're actively collaborating with.
Yeah, at Tamarack, we use a lot Mural in order to do analog system mappings.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are many different ways, and whatever it takes just to help people kind of see their own system and see their own network again with kind of a bird's eye view, like taking yourself out of it and what are actually the patterns of interconnection that are happening here, and then thinking about how can we as a network deliberately weave those connections together. Who is missing from this? What are the gaps that we're seeing? So certainly analog mapping can work well as well.
Thank you, David. Last question, after we will go to the Q&A. It's a question about evaluation. How can we use impact networks to evaluate, to measure our collective impact? What kind of new forms of measurement do this network approach allow us to do?
Given the emergent nature of networks, longer term impacts often cannot be well defined at the very beginning, because defining long-term outcomes before people have even had the chance to get together and think and work together is likely to stifle or limit their ability to self-organize around what they really think is most important. I see a lot of times funders trying to catalyze these networks, but with very, very clear intended outcomes that are very specific and pretty rigid. And that doesn't really give people the chance to actually collectively discover the opportunities that work best for them. And so over time, those longer term impacts can be defined as people begin to think and discuss and work together. But initially, we do know that healthy impact networks share short-term and intermediate-term outcomes that are more definable, including markers of network connectivity and demonstrated value for participants. And I think of these as process metrics. Right? Building a network is a very deliberate process that has emergent results. And so we can track our progress along the way to assess how the network is developing and where there are those opportunities for intervention. 4 attributes of a healthy network come to mind. Number 1 is robust collaborative infrastructure. That's regular meetings, effective coordination, a utilized and useful communication platform. Second is high levels of connectivity among participants, which we can track with these mapping tools. Third is participants having positive experiences engaging with the network. They're deriving value from participation. They're able to speak up and share what's really on their mind. We can assess that with participant experience surveys. And then fourth, the presence of emergent activity, that things are arising out of the network. We can't predict exactly what those are, but we can predict that there will be new collaborative teams and there will be new projects and partnerships developing among network participants. And we can hear the stories of how those are really actually impacting the work that people want to do. These tools, the mapping tools and the participant experience survey, those you can find those on the Converge Network Toolkit. It's all open source with Creative Commons. You can go use it, adapt it to your own. It's at converge.net/toolkit. So if you're curious about kind of using those evaluation tools in your own network, please build on what's there if it's helpful.
Okay, thank you, David. We can move to the Q&A section of the call. Jaime, if you want, I can share some questions. I see on the Q&A on the chat that you've already, David, answered a few of these questions about what the connections are representing. So I have a question, a very technical question, as a follow-up to the software question. Does it allow for sizing the bubble points based on power dynamics or some other measure of the size, power of the entity? So
yeah, you can You can size them in many different ways, but my preferred way often is using a measure called betweenness centrality, which is really a measure of how often somebody is along the shortest path between other two people. So how often somebody is the connector between two other people. And so there you can see who are really kind of the bridgers and the key hubs of this network, and you can size those nodes based on that.
Yeah, and you can size the nodes and you can size the links also, and that's very powerful. So it was a question from Michael. We have a question from AB. Very interesting questions. What are your thoughts about the role of networks at different scales? For example, local versus global. Personally, if I may, I'm using social mapping tools at both scales. In fact, they are helpful at a very, very small scale, even at the scale of an organization, and also at a larger scale. This is my perspective, but what about you, David?
Yeah, I agree. I think they're pretty flexible. The biggest challenge for this mapping work, from my perspective, is how we get the data in the first place in a way that doesn't overburden participants. And so you have to be thinking about, how are we going to actually be serving people, and are they going to be able to, willing to respond? And the way to do that is to actually provide them with something that's really valuable to them. And so I often, in this type of social network analysis work, will also do at the same time asset mapping, where we're asking people to share their skills and their issue area focus and their geographic focus and so forth. And the result of that is a map that participants themselves can use to very easily filter through it and identify, I'm looking for somebody who has education expertise, and in this specific region, right, they can find who that person is and actually make the connection with them. It doesn't have to go through some coordinator. So, kind of enticing people with that asset map that's really built for them and useful for them is a great way. And also then sharing the maps as they evolve and people start to understand how they're used and why they're useful, that will incentivize people to jump in as well. But I do see, at different scales, it can be useful. One example is I've seen a map of a company that spanned multiple regions, and the main question that they asked in that map is, who do you most often turn to for important information or advice on key decisions? And what was fascinating about this resulting map is then they sized the nodes based on how often a particular person was named by their colleagues as the key person they turned to. And it was fascinating because the CEOs and the members of the C-suite were actually very, very small. Very few people actually turned to them for key advice. And instead, the person who had the largest node, who was most often turned to for advice, was somebody at the lowest level of the hierarchy. And so would probably be commonly overlooked by people in power in the organization, but really seeing that person was such a key figure, such a key influence, and such a positive influence in the organization. Who wouldn't have known that otherwise.
Yeah, this is something that I really like to do when I do network mapping, is to superpose, to put together the formal relations and the informal relation in the networks and see the differences. It's really fascinating, and you can do that at the scale of a group, the scale of an organization, or a large territory. We have another question from Noura. What have you learned about network building that has shaped how you have led or contributed to networks since that first experience in Fresno? What have been some of your blind spots and most common blind spots for networks leaders you've known? Wow.
That is a huge question. Not to just pitch the book, but the book really kind of shares the lessons I've learned it's really born out of those experiences and all the different resources that I've tried to absorb, and other shoulders of giants that I stand on and have learned so much from. And that Fresno experience was the very first one almost 10 years ago, but worked with almost 50 different networks since then, and each one is so different in terms of the people involved and the context of the place and the history. But it's been fascinating to see that there's often so much that's similar in terms of how they evolve and the type of leadership that's required, and kind of the processes that they take to have these moments of convenings. And one of the key things that has stood out is just the importance of convening, of being together. And that can be in a virtual space. It can be in an in-person space, but really importantly, that's not bringing people together for a conference to go watch a speaker or watch a panel and then some kind of networking activities in between. It's really taking advantage of the people who are there in the room, the experts, that the people who are there on the ground doing the work. They're the experts, and really taking the time to do things in person or when we're all together that can only be done when we're all together, like building relationships, like sharing stories, like doing some kind of larger systemic analysis that really allows people to move around and think differently and so forth. That act of convening is really present in, I think, all the networks that I've seen be successful, and so that's something that I've really taken to heart, that those moments really can't be missed and are so precious.
Cool. I see that there is a lot of activity in the chat, so that's nice. I have a last question from Elliot, and I think it's a kind of wrapping up question, because you already talked a little bit about this, but I think it's a good way to wrap up the call today. How important or helpful is it in any specific network to do this kind of mapping or visualization to establish network resilience? So how do you how do we develop resilience of a network by mapping it?
I think I've seen it be very helpful, and then I've seen it places where the mapping work is done and then it's kind of never referred to again, and not really useful. And so I would say, if you're going to do a mapping process, like, make sure that somebody is actually on point for using it and for bringing that data forward into considerations around how we're going to convene people together, how we're weaving people together, what types of facilitation we're doing. Some really specific examples is, I've used the maps to actually intentionally form groups at convenings or in between convenings, between people who really should know each other because they're working in the same area or working in a similar region, but don't already have that connection together. So actually intentionally using that data to intentionally weave the connections together, identifying where there are different clusters, and then developing activities to connect people between those different clusters. So do it if you're actually going to use it, right? And then also, if you're interested in doing it, try to capture the first data as early as possible, right? Ideally, even before the network has formed together or come together for convening in the first place, because then you're going to be able to see the progression and the effects of the intentional network cultivation that you've been doing. And that can be a really powerful story that you can tell to funders, to show the effect of your work, because again, those longer term outcomes, they're going to take a while. Systems change work takes a really, really long time, but we can show on the path of that we're increasing connection, we're increasing communication, there's more and more coordination and collaboration happening. The system is changing, right, as a result of this work. And that's also a really powerful story for participants too, to see that change as people are kind of, jumping at the bit to get to action. And when are we going to see those tangible outcomes? Well, it's like those are coming, but this is also a tangible outcome, right? Strengthening the connections and the flows of communication and resources across a system is a very positive outcome that's going to lead to some of the other things that we want to see.
Cool. So David, we are at the end of our time together today. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on your knowledge with us. And also thank you to all who attended today as well, and for your thoughtful question. Jaime, over to you to close the webinar, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. As you can see from what I shared in the chat box, that we have 2 upcoming workshops we wanted to share with you. One on Collective Impact 3.0 on November 22nd, and one on Asset-Based Community Development 101. We're really looking forward to ABCD 101, which is going to be offered in English and French, once on November 1st and in French on November 17th. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.